It is. And again, thank you for being here. Our next expert is Paul Lewis. Paul is Vice President in Policy and Finance, Enos Center for Transportation. Paul Lewis is in this capacity, he directs Enos policy research programs, including paper development and print organization. Lewis has led policy projects related to the federal policy, transportation planning, and transportation governance, including Enos transportation finance, freight, and aviation working groups. Lewis has also led research on emerging mobility and automated vehicles. With that, let's introduce Paul Lewis to the show this evening. Paul?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you for being here. We're going to try and get to some issues tonight related to the gas tax, which I know is an issue that's near and dear to a lot of people as I've traveled the state over the last 30 days. Talk about the issues, talk about the perspective, and get both of your viewpoints. I can tell you that when I was a member of Congress, I was a supporter of a user fee. I believe that we needed to look at ways to be able to fix our roads and bridges without pushing it onto the debt and deficits for our children and grandchildren. But I also believe that we shouldn't do anything very quickly. And there were a lot of ways to come up with solutions, including possibly raising the gas tax. One of the things I did is in legislation was I set up a piece of legislation that actually indexed the gas tax, but gave Congress 2 years to come up with a solution, looked at a number of various issues, come up with ways of maybe reducing costs and timelines, and then come up with a plan which may have reduced the gas tax in its entirety. So in that case, we were looking at all of the above solution, which I think is important. So let's talk about some of those issues and see where we go with this as we allow also some people from the outside to ask some questions. So let's think about it. How did we get here? You know, we've had no user fees since 2005 in Ohio. We had a bonding of the Ohio Turnpike. And Greg, I want to go to you here for a second to talk about that, because it appears that what we've done, or what the previous administration did, was they bonded the Turnpike, borrowed $1.6 billion, and then borrowed money over a 33-year period. Now, I can tell you in the business world, you normally don't borrow for a longer period of time than the useful life of what you're paying for. And that would clearly be a problem. So, Greg, can you talk a little bit about the bonding of the Ohio Turnpike? And that's one of the reasons we're where we're at today when it comes to the gas tax and infrastructure spending.
Sure. You know, I think Governor Kasich at the time he was in office was attempting to do what he and his team considered to be an innovative proposal to be able to get additional money in. I think they saw that there was challenges, long-term funding challenges here in Ohio. And the last time the gas tax had been raised was back in 2005. That's when they increased it. It was 2 cents for 3 years, up to from 22 cents to 28 cents. But there was a deficit coming. Inflation obviously erodes purchasing power. That's one issue. And he wanted to get money there. So they used the Turnpike. And what they essentially did is they bonded against the toll revenues that the Turnpike would be able to generate. And they used that money on projects in the northern half of the state, or projects that were supposed to be close to the Turnpike, so that they could then free up other money that the Department of Transportation, or ODOT, was getting from the gas tax to then spend in other parts of the state. The idea being, we're going to leverage an asset that we have here in Ohio. We can do more with the Turnpike. And because of that, we're going to get all this extra money that we're going to be able to use. It's one-time funding. It did help temporarily, but it wasn't designed to be an ongoing revenue stream. And you got to pay the debt back. As you said, it's kind of a rough situation when you have to pay debt longer than the asset itself. And so we have a real problem there. But I'll tell you, you know, so we have the Turnpike issues, one thing, But the State Department of Transportation has been doing their own bonding as well. And so there's a lot of challenges here. I think that when we look back at it, we weren't big fans at the Buckeye Institute of that proposal. We didn't hammer the proposal at the time, but we were very concerned about the sustainability of that funding stream. And I think that concern has been borne out and has helped to facilitate a situation where we find ourselves in a hole.
It's interesting, Greg, because you just confirmed what I said as well, is that we borrowed money, again, borrowed from our children and grandchildren's future. We are now going to pay that back over 33 years for, 1.5 or 1.6 billion dollars that was able to fill this in a short term, but now we're going to be paying it back over the long term. So let's talk a little bit about user fees versus general revenue fund, because a lot of the listeners and a lot of people watching this don't understand why we have a gas tax that pays for roads and bridges versus why aren't we just using tax dollars and the general fund. And Greg, maybe you can explain that. I know we're going to be taking some questions from many of the people watching, but this will give some indication as to why aren't we going into the general fund? Why are we just using a user fee or a gas tax?
Well, and it's a great question, and I think a lot of people probably don't always think about what this is, how that operates. But general revenues, something like an infrastructure on the highways, are obviously heavily utilized assets, and it's a nicer, cleaner way to do it when you have a user fee. In other words, if you use it, you pay for it. If you don't use it, you don't pay. Whereas everybody who has a job is paying an income tax. Everybody who makes any kind of purchase at all is obviously paying sales tax. But particularly the income tax, I'll point out again, is something that's it's a penalty for working, is what the income tax really is. We need revenues, so we have to find multiple ways to acquire them for government to do its services. But we should understand the income tax is one of the more negative on growth. So the gas tax is about as close historically to a perfect user fee as we've had, because historically it's been tethered to you drive more, you buy more gas. Now that's starting to change a little bit because of the advent of different types of vehicles now. So that's kind of a long-term problem that we have to talk about. But for right now, the gas tax is a true user fee. And in Ohio, I think a critical point is that we have a constitutional protection in Ohio for these gas tax revenues. Excuse me. Even unlike the federal gas tax and unlike some of the gas taxes in other states, this money has to be spent on highways and roads and bridges and things here in the state. It can't be siphoned off for other purposes. And so this protection that we have in Ohio, it's been in the state constitution since, I believe, the 1940s, has really helped to make sure that the gas tax remains true to the purpose of being a user fee. So, the other problem with using general revenues, as you mentioned earlier, Jim, is it's a little more opaque. It's not as obvious what you're doing. The gas tax, as long as we have this provision with the Constitution where people can know that the money goes to where it's supposed to go, they know it's being used right. And so when you start commingling all the funds together in general revenues, it's a lot more challenging to know that you're getting the bang for the buck and that things are doing what you want them to do. So we believe that the gas tax, as it's currently constructed, is an appropriate mechanism for funding highways. And it is a user fee, and that's a lot better, more transparent, ultimately to the end users than trying to parcel out money that you generated from other business taxes or, again, the income tax and sales tax.
Thank you, Greg. And before we go on to Paul, because I've got some questions for him, there's a line item in the state budget called the ISTVS, excess funding from state agencies. And there are some people that have asked me over the last month, why aren't we taking those excess funds and at least reducing the amount that we have to use or have to raise a gas tax by? Can you just touch on that quickly as well and your thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, I think the Buckeyes, so we've been pretty out there and very straightforward in saying that we think that user fees, especially for infrastructure, again, for all the reasons I cited earlier, is a better way of doing it. Now, that said, we've also been very public in saying that we recognize the gas tax hits certain types of people. Well, it hits everybody. And it definitely can be a regressive tax that hits people at the lower end of the economic ladder a little more. So we have actually called for offsets. In fact, the state Senate is debating about whether or not maybe we'll do some kind of other taxes, maybe an income tax reduction, a variety of different things you can do, but to do offsets to then tapping into the general revenues to do the roads. I think we want to keep it as clean as possible so that taxpayers know that the money that they're paying at the pump is ultimately being returned to the roads that they are then using their vehicles on. And I think that's a really important thing that we want to hold on to. But we still, again, recognize that we do need to really understand the overall tax burden that Ohioans have, and we need to be very cognizant of that and try to find a way to make it as fair as possible by offsetting the burden in other areas and maybe cutting other government areas of spending so that we can focus on what we should be focusing on. And one of those things is certainly infrastructure.
Thank you. And Paul, we're going to come to you now on some general questions, not so much related to Ohio, but really related across the country. One is, what are some of the alternative options to the gas tax and funding infrastructure? Can you give us some ideas and some alternatives?
Sure. So across the country, states fund their transportation systems in many different ways. There's either through some kind of user-based revenue like gas taxes or tolls, registration fees, truck tire taxes. I mean, there's a lot of different user-based fees and taxes. And then, of course, there's general fund revenues like sales taxes and income taxes that also go to support transportation. Transportation is a system, and depending on the level of government, you find different mixes of each one of those. At the state level, most states get most of their revenues from fuel taxes. That's the number one source. But there is a mixture of different types of tolls and user fees, as well as general taxation that supports transportation at the state level across the country.
So Paul, also, how many states primarily fund infrastructure via the gas tax? We have 50 states out there. How many are using the gas tax? How many are using a hybrid? How many are using other methods? Do you kind of have an idea that you can let our viewers, give our viewers an indication of?
Yeah, so every state uses a hybrid model, even Ohio. I mean, there are some transfers into the Ohio DOT that come from general funds and other sources. Ohio has a toll road that it uses for some of its revenues. So they all rely on a variety of different sources. And some states are more dependent on fuel taxes than others. Ohio is, I think, 80 or 90% of its revenue for transportation comes from fuel taxes. So it's pretty heavily dependent. Ohio also has one of the lowest fuel taxes in the region. It's about average nationwide, but if you look at neighboring states like Michigan, Indiana, Kentucky, Pennsylvania, they all have higher fuel taxes than they do in Ohio.
I've heard that, and I know I travel to Pennsylvania all the time. One of my congressional colleagues last year and always refused to talk about gas tax is because of the increase in Pennsylvania. And he actually had mentioned a couple times that how many people drive across the border from Pennsylvania, Ohio to get gas because it was less costly than staying in Pennsylvania. I, for one, know that when I go to visit my 92-year-old mother, that I always stop in Ohio before I enter Pennsylvania, and then I refill when I get back to Ohio. So that's another issue, I think, because some of the states around us have increased their gas tax. Paul, what do states with the best infrastructures do for funding, and is it quality cost proportional?
Yeah, so I got that question was sent to me earlier, and I was doing a little research, and one of the interesting things is there's no real way to measure who has the best infrastructure. Now, some states rank it differently, and you can look online and see which state has the best infrastructure. I think generally, states in the southern part of the country have better infrastructure, and that's in large part because they don't have the freeze-thaw cycle that we do in Ohio. And so it's much easier for them to maintain the roads, and they don't have to worry so much about potholes popping up every spring. But if you do look at the states that tend to get ranked pretty high in the northern half of the country, states like Minnesota or Vermont that are consistently pretty good, they tend to have higher gas taxes and generally invest more per driver or per capita into their roadway and transit systems And they tend to also have a more diverse set of transportation options for folks.
So this question will be for both you, Paul and Greg. Are there new, yet to be tested forms of funding and also cost savings? Because, in Washington, I know we talked about a number of funding sources, but also cost savings. One of the biggest issues that I found when I was moving to try and make sure we weren't borrowing, against our children and grandchildren's future was people said, first, we better look at the way we're spending the money and some of the expenses that we use to fix our roads and bridges. Let's make sure our contractors, if they build a road, they're required to make sure it lasts. All those things you would do in the normal business cycle or in the real world, as I call it, outside of government spending. So let's start with you, Paul, and then move to Greg on answering that question. Are there other sources, new tested forms? And what are some of the things possibly we can do when it comes to our spending, especially when it's related just to the roads and bridges?
So in terms of new funding sources, a couple states are testing out something called a vehicle mile traveled fee. And that's where you would install some kind of transponder or some kind of mechanism in a car. And instead of paying by the gallon, you would pay by the mile. And that makes it a more true user fee. You could direct it back into the roads that get the most amount of use. And they're kind of testing it at the same level as what a gas tax would be, which would be maybe around like 1 or 2 cents per mile. And that would total up and be your bill at the end of the year for roadway use. So more thinking of it like a utility rather than a government service. That is still in testing form. There's obviously lots of issues with that, and it's not always popular. But it's one that they're piloting to see if it will work, both politically and practically. I think the real opportunity is to focus on trying to make our transportation institutions more efficient. And a lot of that has to do with investing smartly, not necessarily focusing on big, expansive projects, but more doing the things that voters actually are looking for, which is roads that are well maintained, buses that run on time, kind of the run-of-the-mill stuff that isn't as exciting as a new highway or some kind of new big project, but it's the things that people care about every day. And it's really kind of focusing on asset management and taking better care of what we have.
Greg, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with everything that was just said. In particular, we have in Ohio, we have a very large highway system. We're I think the 4th largest number of highways of any state in the country. So we have quite a lot of mileage that we do here in Ohio, and that's a good thing. It's good for our economy and everything else. But what that implies is also, again, the asset management process. We have 70, 71, 75, 77, the big arteries that do cross-country type travel. We need to make sure those things are top tier. 80, of course, with the Turnpike, although it's a little different because of it being the toll road. So we need to make sure we manage that process first. I think a lot of times folks get very hung up, transportation officials get hung up on this, local government officials get hung up on this, but you kind of have the ribbon cutting ceremony and the big new things that we're going to do. I mean, occasionally you do need to do something new. Certain interchanges are truly unsafe, and maybe you do need to do an overhaul that is a multi-million-dollar overhaul to assure that safety is there, or you can reduce congestion. But, Ohio's population hasn't been growing that much lately. Now, it has in Central Ohio, so that's a little different. So I think we need to, figure that out and focus there. I'll also point out, though, on the cost saving side and maybe even a little bit of revenue side, too. First of all, we call for dealing with prevailing wage. Prevailing wage is something that most governments do here. It basically tabs contracting to union wages. And so that tends to inflate the costs of construction. Some people will say that there are safety-oriented issues with that. We want to do that. I think that the state has, in other types of construction, saved significant amounts of money when it didn't do prevailing wage, for example, on school construction. And obviously schools are different than roads, but that's a big deal. It really matters. So those savings were significant. I think we should look at that so that every dollar can be stretched further. Another thing is, we've started to experiment around with some of the advertising stuff and companies, kind of adopting a highway type approach and things like that. I think we could do more in that line too. I don't think that's going to be the thing that's a silver bullet that's going to solve everything, but every little bit, there's a supplemental income that can come in from that. So I think it's a combination of good asset management. We should stretch money a little further with probably prevailing wage reform. And then we should look to outside folks in the private sector who want to, yes, maybe put their name on something, but we do that all the time with sports stadiums and other types of assets. We probably should consider doing that. And I guess finally, I'd say, let's just be really smart about every project that we do. Government always has that shiny object thing, and I think I mentioned before the blue ribbon cutting. Everybody likes that. Legislators like that in general. Political folks like that in general. But not everything is needed. So let's make sure that we're focusing on the assets that we have now.
I appreciate that. And one of the things that you didn't mention, I'd like to ask you about, is private public partnerships like TIF financing, tax incremental financing. A lot of small communities are doing that. Sometimes it's has some regulatory burden to it that could be eased somewhat. But any thoughts on that? Because there's an example of where when the private sector comes in and adds on to an intersection or adds into an area, they end up having to pay, based on the real estate valuation, the costs of all that infrastructure, which would relieve some of the burden for the state. Any thoughts on that?
I think that you can certainly do that. I think that's also going to be really helpful at the local level. I mean, one of the things, the gas tax, a lot of it does go to ODOT, but a good chunk of it, 40 or 45%, I forget the number off the top of my head, is actually distributed to locals. And then, of course, they have other revenue streams that they do too. So in particular, some of the projects I think that you were just mentioning, Jim, could benefit from something like that because those are going to be development projects, and they're going to be heavily local type projects where local leaders and local officials are going to want to be engaged in that. So I think that's an area that we could really take a look at too.
So today I was also talking to a large political subdivision here in the state of Ohio, and they were telling me that they receive revenues from 15,000 vehicle registrations a year, approximately 15,000 vehicle registrations. And their big concern was that if they took the 15,000 vehicles times the average amount that's driven per vehicle, and you could say it's 15,000 miles a year, and they multiplied that times the increase of 18 cents a gallon, which I think the governor proposed, and even 10 cents, which the House has proposed, and I know the Senate's going to be proposing something too. But if you multiplied that out, that would be over $1 million that they would receive if they were just able to keep that money. Those were their vehicles driving in their political subdivision. Yet when they give the money to the state and it goes up there as a gas tax, they only estimate getting $300,000 or $400,000 back. And they said it's not worth it to them. They would rather take care of their own roads and bridges within their own subdivision and have the state, or their own political subdivision, and have the state leave them alone. I just like to throw that out too and hear your perspective.
I think it's something that is worth having a conversation about further. I think that local government is Ohio. We're very proud of our local government. We have home rule institution, and so we're very pleased with that. And I think that by and large, certain things like interstates and stuff like that are always going to have a state component to it because of the largeness of them and the way that in which they go through the state. So I think that ODOT will always have that role. But for a lot of these, other types of projects that, again, have a very local focus, local development, or local safety, whatever, I think, there's,
Paul, we're going to come to you now. How has the federal government's funding impacted the state's financial burden in recent years?
Yeah, so I just wanted to make one comment on the last point. When we're talking about local and state, and we deal with the same thing with federal money distributed back out to the states, transportation is an interconnected network, and especially in some of the areas where there's lots of jobs, a lot of people will drive from their political subdivision into the other ones. And so it is a network, and there is a role for the state to make sure that roads network-wide are getting taken care of. And it does leave some communities maybe with a less return on their quote unquote investment and per population. But some roads do get beat up because all the commuters are coming in for their jobs. And hopefully ODOT has some kind of program to take care of that. And it's something that happens a lot at the federal government too. I mean, the federal government has been funding the Highway Trust Fund for the past 60 years. And that money is coming mostly from the gas tax. Our current reauthorization was in 2015. It's a 5-year bill, and so that money will run out in 2020. The money from Washington has been pretty consistent, but it hasn't been anything remarkable. It's been a lot of the status quo. I think that a lot of states are hungry for more money from the federal government. There's a lot of talk about an infrastructure bill on both sides of the aisle. But right here in Washington right now, I haven't seen a whole lot of actual action on that level, and so we're still kind of waiting to see if Congress and the president can put together something that everyone agrees on. But in the meantime,
Paul, one of the things you mentioned in 2015, there was a reauthorization. I will tell you this, I did not support that. I was in Congress at the time because it was paid for with not user fees, but a lot of gimmicks and gadgets. I still remember one of the gimmicks in the reauthorization was that we're going to sell excess oil reserves for like $79 a barrel when they were only at 43 at the time. And I doubt they've even got anywhere near $79 a barrel. There was excess fees put on baggage transportation, on airlines, a whole bunch of other things. There really weren't user fees attached to the roads and bridges. And what we really end up doing, we never go back and check those things to determine that. What we really did, even in that case, was borrowed against our children and grandchildren's future because we really didn't have a user fee. So I bring that back to your attention because it was one of the concerns I had. I continually see us, especially in the federal government, just borrowing against our children and grandchildren's future instead of paying for what we're using. It's one of the reasons why I do appreciate talking about user fees. And I think it's important that we continue to make sure we're not borrowing against our children and grandchildren's future, even like Governor Kasich did when he borrowed against the Turnpike. Again, taking care of roads and bridges over 6, 7, 8, even 10 years and paying for it over 33 years means that it's not normally what you do in the real business world. We're starting to get some questions now from people that are watching, and I want to bring some of those up and see what some of your answers would be. First question I have is from Craig. Craig wants to know, why isn't the gas tax something that we put on a statewide ballot for the voters? Greg, can you answer that or maybe address that?
I suppose the legislature could, in fact, do that. There wouldn't be something that I mean, sometimes they will do that. Like when you have local government, sometimes they'll do an income tax issue and they'll put it on the ballot. So in theory, I suppose you could make a decision to do that. I think, though, that this is an issue where the legislature has perhaps, not necessarily this legislature, but previous General Assemblies have I don't want to say, I guess, punted a little bit on some of this and some of the things we were talking about earlier with the Turnpike, kind of papering over to a large degree some of the systemic issues that were there. So in that sense, the legislature, I think, is doing what they were hired to do when they got elected. They're wrestling with an issue that is a tough issue. It's a painful issue. Again, I think there need to be offsets to the gas tax, whatever the number that they come up to is, because of the burden aspect of it. But we want legislators to lead. It's an interesting thing. We oftentimes say we want legislators to do things, and we're like, why can't they ever make a tough decision? And now they're wrestling with something that is tough because, hiking the gas tax is a tough thing. People are going to have to answer to that in their next election. And there's going to be a lot of people who probably aren't happy, even if you did an offset. So this is a tough thing, and they can be held accountable. And if the roads don't get fixed and the potholes keep coming back, and people don't see the value after something like this happens, I think there's going to be consequences come November next year and subsequent years.
Well, sure. And again, that's hopefully that's why anybody watching this Facebook Live broadcast is actually getting a chance to see. Here's some answers. They don't get enough of these questions answered by their legislators, and hopefully they're getting some questions answered today. Next question is from Dan. Haven't all the taxes we've been paying already been going toward infrastructure? And then the second question from Dan was, why can't we use the rainy day fund to help us repair some of our infrastructure? Again, Greg, you want to try and touch base on that one?
First of all, yes, the gas tax has been going to roads and infrastructure. There is, and I'm not sure that I'm completely wedded to I think the 18 cents is probably overstating it, but it's difficult to know exactly by how much. But there is a legitimate issue with inflation that erodes the cost of the materials when you don't have. And I'm not a fan of indexing. We're not at the Buckeye Institute fans of indexing. There's a good reason for doing it. I understand there's a good technical reason for doing it. We prefer, though, to make legislators take the decision on an ongoing basis, and if they have to raise it again, then they should come back and do that. But I guess the issue is that there really is an erosion to purchasing power is the bottom line. So there is an issue there, and that has been a growing issue. And had there been adjustments perhaps in the intervening years, there wouldn't be such a hole today. But because we did things like the Turnpike and stuff like that, we did and bonded. And actually, that's something I forgot to mention earlier. We're spending an awful lot of debt service through ODOT. This isn't even the Turnpike stuff. They're spending, I think it's the beginning of this next fiscal year, they're going to spend $300 million on debt service for road money that's already been spent on roads in the past. So that is gas tax money going to debt service for stuff that they've already done. That's not the ongoing maintenance, much less new projects. So I think some of the debt stuff that ODOT has been doing, even aside from the Turnpike, has probably been a little problematic, and again masked some of this stuff. So the money is going there, I guess, to answer the question, but there is an erosion of purchasing power. Now, as far as the rainy day fund is designed to be there so that when the economy takes a turn for the worse, we have something in the kind of the savings account. It's a big number. I mean, it's $2 billion plus, but in terms of the state budget, that's all funds considered, 140 billion something dollars over 2 fiscal years. $2 billion isn't that much. And if we hit a recession, certainly if we hit anything like the Great Recession or even the recession we had in the early 2000s, we're going to want some cushion so that we can be smart about what we do, because in that time period, the worst thing you can do is raise taxes in a recession or take a meat cleaver rather than a scalpel to government spending. You want to be very careful with what you do. So the rainy day fund, up to the point that it's at now, makes sense. If you tap into that for this, that's one-time money. It's not systemic. It's not ongoing. And then you lose the ability to have that for its stated purpose, which is when the economy takes a turn for the worse.
Lynn asks a question, and I think it's a good one. ODOT accountability. Can ODOT be audited to see where money was spent or misspent before we start raising taxes and asking for more money from the taxpayers? Great question. I think Auditor Faber is talking about these reviews. Mm-hmm. Again, sometimes we jump too quickly when I say politicians jump too quickly when they just automatically say the only answer is raising taxes or raising the gas tax. And I think this is one of the things I'm starting to see from many of the questions being asked. But what can we do about an ODOT audit and making sure that the money was spent, or was it misspent, and making sure it was spent in the right places?
A performance audit, you mentioned what Auditor Faber is interested in. I cannot recollect if previous Auditor Yost, now Attorney General Yost, did one for ODOT while Kasich was in office. I'd have to go back and look at that. But that is one way of looking at it, is looking at what are the processes that we have internally at ODOT, and that's something that the auditor can certainly do. And I think that that's always a good thing to do with very large state agencies. So I think that certainly those are important things. I think too, you got to look at what is our cost compared to other states. I think you can do some of that through some of the performance auditing as well, to make sure that our cost structure is not well outside what it probably should be. So those aren't, again, particularly, I guess, sexy kind of things, but those are nuts and bolts kind of things that we could do. And I think if you had one of those done for ODOT, there'd be people still probably wouldn't be happy with any kind of a gas tax increase because nobody would be, but at least you'd have a little more comfort, I think, for taxpayers, because I think the thing that really bothers folks is feeling like we spend all this money, we've always spent this money, and yet there's still the potholes coming and stuff like that. It has that sense of things, and people don't think it's being done. And even if the audit doesn't find anything that's been done not correctly, it can still help to make sure that people feel comfortable and feel like their government is being responsive.
Yeah, and I think another thing that we've noticed at Eno is that when we're looking around the country, in the past 6 years, we've seen almost 30 states raise their gas tax. So this isn't just an Ohio problem. I mean, it's the infrastructure is getting more expensive as the economy grows bigger and the labor market gets tighter and cost of materials goes up. And inflation has eroded away these fixed gas taxes. And so states are increasingly turning to this to just continue the status quo. And it's just kind of Ohio is not unique in that they're grappling with this issue.
Yeah, Sandy asked a question, why now? Why 18 cents or even 10 cents? Why not an incremental increase? Why not a review of current spendings? Why always just a tax increase and not a spending reduction?
Well, sorry, Jim, but I would definitely say that we need to have spending reductions in government. I think infrastructure is one of the things government has to do. So roads and bridges and safety, and again, the economic aspect of what transportation means to Ohio because of its geographic location, its ability to have a lot of truck traffic moving goods. The logistics industry is very important to Ohio, lots of jobs associated with that, with manufacturing plants. So this is an important thing, but we do spend money in other parts of the budget that are really not good. In fact, we're going to have a Piglet book, we call it, at the Buckeye Institute, where we look at other spending. Now, that's not road spending per se necessarily, but it's other areas. And the reason that's important is because if you look at the overall budget, and I kind of come back to the offset question, I think it's important that we do an offset for any kind of the gas tax. And I also think a step up, I think that there are some real questions about what the 18 cents is the right number. And I think that there's some other numbers, and I suspect that it's not going to be 18 cents when this is all said and done. You could knock me over with a feather if that's what it turns out to be, notwithstanding where the governor is at on it. It just doesn't seem like that's where the legislature is moving towards at present. But a step up, that might make sense. But I think the critical thing is we need to look at the other areas of the budget where we spend money on subsidies for arts issues, and $4 million here, $5 million there on soccer stadiums in different parts of the state, which we do all the time in state budgets and capital budgets. Maybe we should stop spending money over there, cut people's taxes elsewhere. That way, if we do have to make these hard decisions on a gas tax, we're not adding to the overall burden. We're doing what we need to do and doing what people expect, which is make the roads safe and work well for our economy.
Kathy asked, and she asked, what about lottery and casino money that was supposed to be used to help our roads and our schools?
Some of that is happening more at the local level. So there is some money that's coming from the racinos and the casinos, but I would say that yes, there's new revenue that comes in with those kind of things, but they rarely get the revenue targets that people think they're going to get. They may offer some supplemental funding, but they're not ever going to be the core thing. It's kind of like when the state lottery was supposed to fix school funding problem here in Ohio. Well, that didn't really happen there either. So I know what's said in the campaigns to legalize these things. I think there were a few overstatements. So yes, there's revenue there, and there has been some revenue that's gone to the local governments, especially from those sources, but it's never going to be enough. And I think it was oversold.
Yes, Scott asked a question, and I guess this could probably be asked on every state government and any government. Why is it always just easy to raise the gas tax or any tax? Why isn't it Why don't governments at least look at cutting across the board or even freezing expenditures, and then taking a look at where they can cut before they raise taxes? I think you've already touched a little bit on that, but
Sure.
any more thoughts on that, or even across the state? I mean, again, Paul, or across the country. Paul, do you have any thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, we rarely see states cut their fuel taxes, and it's not because there's these all these people that are lining their pockets with tax dollars. I mean, I think it's expensive to maintain infrastructure, and Ohio has a tremendous amount of roads. And in order to maintain that with the freeze and thaw cycles and the increase in freight traffic we've seen, it's very expensive. And so we track a lot of these things. This gas tax does not seem to be one that's extraordinary or kind of out of the order when we look at all states. We absolutely should do a better job measuring what we invest in and what are our outcomes. I think that that's something consistently we don't do a great job in, and I think that that's something that we're starting to see some departments of transportation doing a better job of. But starting to demonstrate, why is it worth what we're doing? And Jim, you were talking earlier about the problems at the federal government. And why we can't raise the fuel tax to pay for the infrastructure fund at the federal government. And a lot of that is that voters aren't seeing the value, and they don't want the taxes raised unless you can demonstrate exactly what you're building and exactly why you need the money. And so I think it's incumbent on state agencies to demonstrate that they are making progress, they are getting return on value. And then the counter side is, what if you don't raise the fuel tax? What does that mean? And I think that you have to kind of play both sides of it.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting you said that, Paul, because in 2015, if you go back to my bill, as I said earlier, was the index, which was less than a half a penny of raising of the gas tax over a 2-year period until we came up with a new solution or a better solution or even cutting costs. And even then, Democrats and Republicans would not support less than a half a penny. So it is a tough sell. I see states doing it. All the states around us are doing it. But again, I think it's an issue that most people that drive a car or hear about it do have some concerns about it. I've been traveling the state now for the last 30 days, and even though I'm not talking about the gas tax, it comes up in every forum and every discussion. So let's talk about some of the other ways of paying for it. I know we're quickly wrapping up on the time we allotted, but in Washington, we used to say there were 4 user fees. You touched on one, which is miles driven. We know the gas tax is one. We also know there's another one called tolling, and some states are doing that. And the last one, of course, is either weight distribution or costs associated with the value of the vehicle that's driving on the roads and bridges. Any other thoughts to any of those other user fees? They're all user fees. The simplest one, of course, is the gas tax, the easiest one to administer. But any other thoughts on some of those others I mentioned?
Yeah, so from our perspective, we've seen an awful lot of testing, implementation. There's
Are we losing Paul?
To charge folks on a pilot basis. We've also seen some examples where tolling is happening. The system, you can't toll. There's a federal prohibition on tolling, and so even if the state wanted to, they'll find it really challenging. So lots of testing, but the go-to is the gas tax because it's the easiest.
Everything there, the gas tax is certainly the easiest right now, but I will say.
Did I lose everybody?
Oh,
You're still with us. You're still with us.
Okay.
Go ahead, Greg.
So the problem is that the wedge is being introduced in the gas tax in terms of being a user fee now, and it's still at the front end, so it's not as huge of a problem. But electric vehicles, hybrids, even just increased fuel efficiency standards, these things are starting to introduce a wedge where the gas tax used to be that really good user fee. It's going to start to become a little bit less of a user fee because you're going to start to have more vehicles in the fleet that may not be paying their fair share through the gas tax. In fact, partially to deal with the fairness issue, the House of Representatives put in an electric vehicle fee a hybrid fee, and it's not going to raise that much revenue. But the concept is, hey, these guys aren't paying anything right now, and typically it's wealthier individuals who are getting some of these vehicles, and so you're going to raise the gas tax on the guy with the beater trucks.
Well, I'm not quite sure what happened, but if anyone can hear me or see me, I'm going to be signing off. But thanks for joining, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Well, Greg, I think you're still on, and we're going to.
I am. Although I've been having a few issues, so if I accidentally get lost, I'll apologize in advance.
Well, we're going to wrap this up here real shortly. We have just a couple more questions, which I think would be important, and then we'll wrap it up.
I do want to just say the toll road question that I think I heard a little bit about. I do think we should have the feds look at giving us a little more ability to work with tolls. Tolls is a user fee. Nobody likes tolls, but if you phase in tolls and phase down the gas tax over time and do it as replacement, you don't want to do tolls and gas tax, because then you're basically double taxing people. That's not right at all. But I think we do want to look at looking at that in lieu of the gas tax over time, because this whole thing with these new vehicles and the fleet changing is going to create a problem for the gas tax over time.
Roy asked a question, and Greg, this is right up your alley, I believe, but he's asking, doesn't this large of a tax increase hurt the poor, the middle class, the working poor more than anyone else?
It certainly can, yeah. I think that's true. I think it's a regressive tax. I mean, while it probably is the best mechanism for roads right now, it does have an impact on folks, and it does have a disproportionate impact on people who buy, who still have older vehicles, don't have the gas mileage, people who have to commute long distances, folks who live in rural areas in particular. So yes, it is. And that's, again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but when I talked about the offsets in other areas of taxes, that's what the Buckeye Institute's been out there saying, is we need to do offsets for that very reason, actually, because it is going to create a burden. We do need to invest in the roads, but we need to think about where we're spending our money elsewhere, cut those off, cut that back, and then cut taxes elsewhere, so that we are not doing a net increase on a burden on folks. Again, because he's right. It does hurt those folks disproportionately.
Greg, one other question that just came through too is, I think the House came out with a version where they lowered the gas tax, but they raised it on diesel and the trucks. Ultimately, doesn't that diesel cost end up, even though it doesn't go directly to the consumer is going to pay for that in the cost of, whether it's food or whatever being delivered to, to the stores or whatever they purchase. So ultimately, even the higher diesel costs will end up affecting consumers at some point.
Yeah, it's an indirect tax. I mean, in fact, I wasn't there when they did it, but I think some of the folks from the industry even said, look, you can raise the diesel tax about as much as you want to. We're going to be able to pass it along, or at least pass a good chunk of it along. So I think that's right. I'm not sure that that's necessarily the right response. I think we need to figure out where the target zone really needs to be. I think that we need to understand: is it 18? Is it 10? Is it 5? What is that amount that we really need, and what is that amount we need now? And then we need to do the offsets elsewhere to be fair for everybody that's hit.
Well, I know we are coming to a close, and I know that Paul's back on too. So I'm going to let you both maybe come up with some closing comments about our situation here in Ohio. I'll start with you, Paul. I know you're back with us. As I travel the state, there are a lot of people frustrated. Yes, we do need to make sure we take care of our roads and bridges. You see this across the country. Any closing comments from you before we move to Greg and then I close?
Yeah. So what we've seen is that Ohio is far from the only state that's grappling with the issue of increasing costs of infrastructure, filling in potholes, and kind of this question of can we and should we raise the gas tax? A lot of states are doing it. I think that it is a good idea for Ohioans to be challenging why we're doing it and asking those tough questions. I think ultimately it's probably a good idea for the state, but I think that demanding greater accountability are things that we can see from the state. And I also would encourage folks at Ohio DOT and in DeWine's office to start calling up other states to try to get senses of best practices, because this is where it's going. We're not going to see sweeping infrastructure bill coming from the federal government. We're going to have to make some hard choices in our own state, and I'd encourage the tough questions to be asked.
Greg, for your perspective, I did talk to the governor a few weeks back, talked to him about this issue. He told me that he was going to be looking this over a year's time, really taking a good analysis of it. And then quickly, he formed that committee and they came up with an 18-cent increase. The only reason I bring that up, too fast, too quick, your thoughts and your opinion as we move down this road.
I think that we need to have, I think we need a better understanding of exactly what that 18 cents is. I think some of it is out year projects, not just current projects, not just safety projects, things like that. So I think that there's, and I can understand why you want to look long term too, but I think this is a bitter pill for people to take, and we need to be very cognizant of that. So I think there was a little bit of a long term thing built into it. But I'll be fair. Look, the governor got handed, I think, a bad situation because things were papered over for a while, and we weren't looking at this on an incremental level earlier, and that left us with a bigger hole than we probably did need. So I think that the truth usually in this business is somewhere in the middle. It's rarely all of what one side or the other says on things. And I think that what has to be found here is an appropriate balance. Infrastructure is something that is extremely important for the state of Ohio. There's safety issues, there's economic issues. We've talked about those things. The thing that I find disturbing and that the Buckeye Institute finds disturbing is that we spend money in so many ways in other areas of the budget that we don't need to do. And we should be really paring these things back so that we can focus on what needs to be done. And that we're not just larding tax upon people, because that's when people feel like that they can't take it anymore. And then something like this is really, to them, it's a straw that breaks the camel's back. We need to be accountable across the board when we look at the whole budget.
Well, thank you, Greg. Thank you, Paul. Again, this was an Ohio Future Foundation tax forum to start discussing issues that are important to Ohioans. I hope anyone who's watched got an idea of some of the things we're going to do and challenge, and make sure that individuals across this state get an idea of policies that are affecting them. You know, what can be done different, what can be changed. Again, if you'd like to hear more information about what the current governor did get, as Greg said, he got dealt a bad set of cards from the previous governor when a large chunk of money was used. The turnpike was borrowed against, and now we're going to pay that back over 33 years. But we do need to come up with some solutions. We're going to continue to make sure that these ideas are challenged, these ideas are talked about at Ohio's Future Foundation. I want to thank you for joining us tonight. If you are interested, because we're going to be doing a number of things like this, not only do we have Budget for Dummies, which will be talking about our Ohio budget system and how we budget and how we do things and how we spend monies in Ohio. I think that's going to be important. We're going to have a segment on the bonding, the turnpike, and ask people, especially members, do they think that was a good deal, and some of the issues that affect that as well. So continue to keep an eye on ohiofuturefoundation.org. If you'd love to be a member, we'd love to have you at ohiofuturefoundation.org. Thank you again for being with us this evening. We look forward to having many of these programs again in the future. Take care.